lovely to see you, and so nice to spend an hour with you. So we're going to talk about dialogue and how we can use dialogue to optimize everything, basically. So Sarah and I have both been working with dialogue for quite a while, and we are both fascinated by it. So maybe we can just start off by saying a little bit about ourselves and why we love dialogue so much. So Sarah, do you want to start?
Sure, thank you, Klaus. A very warm welcome to you. I really appreciate if it's possible to have your camera on. That is great. It just really helps build that sense of connection. I know it's not always possible, but great to have cameras on. Thank you if you are able to. Briefly, my background's as a business psychologist, and I came across dialogue about 20 years ago when at the time I was working at the Cabinet Office, and I was working alongside one other psychologist on the fast stream selection process, which is the graduate recruitment scheme. And it was getting really popular. So I think we had about 15,000 applicants that year for 400 places. And our job was to design the assessment centre and online tools and so on. But we were also, I noticed, kind of chasing the expert, bringing in outside experts, and they were coming up with solutions that I felt weren't quite a fit for the culture. Anyway, around that time, I went on my first ever dialogue training programme, run by a member of Bill Isaac's team, and Bill Isaacs has written one of the seminal texts in this area, Dialogue and the Art of Thinking Together. And on this 3-day programme, I just had a complete epiphany moment. And I thought, actually, if at the Cabinet Office we had more of this skill set and we had ways of accessing our collective intelligence there in the room, we'd be able to redesign this selection process without chasing the expert and bringing in all these external consultants. So anyway, I then a little while later left the Cabinet Office and took a deep dive into this whole territory of dialogue and thinking together. I ended up working with Bill Isaacs for about 5 years, part of his team at Dialogus, and I carry on building my own skill set and then helping teams and other groups alongside Klaus build their skill set to have the conversations that really matter. So that's a little bit about my background. Back to you, Klaus.
Thanks, very nice. Well, I came across dialogue theory first time when I was doing my PhD at the Cranfield School of Management. And I really loved the theory because it is, you know, when you do PhDs, you come across a lot of theories and you get to appreciate the ones that are really well crafted. And one of the things that I really like about this model is that it's very simple and therefore it's easy to use. And at the same time, it has depth. So of course, there's always these two. If it's too simple, you can't use it for much. But if it is too complicated, it kind of gets to overfit reality, and you will spend more time trying to understand the model than actually using the model. But I really find that this dialogue has a very good fit. It contains a few models, and they are really good at combining that simplicity and depth. So, and now when I teach a lot at the Copenhagen Business School, I teach leadership courses and entrepreneurship courses, and I try to get some of these models into almost all the courses that I teach. And it's always a real eye-opener for the students. And of course, also when we do more executive trainings, it's also really, I love these courses where people will have these moments of aha throughout the courses, right? Where you see people go, this is why it's not working, or this is what I can do differently. So there's nothing as practical as a good theory, and this is really one of the good ones. Good. So tonight we're going to look at 3 things. So first of all, we're going to look at like how to increase productivity of any dialogue. And this is the interesting thing, right? Because anything that we do in organizations or in life, really with other people, the common factor is dialogue. We have dialogue. So if we can increase the productivity of dialogue, then we increase like everything across the board. This is why it's so interesting to focus on. And so we're going to share with you a simple tool that you can use immediately on how to do that. What can we listen for and change about dialogues so that we can optimize the dialogues. Then we're going to look at how we can use dialogue to save time. Many times I think when people think about dialogue, they say, oh, yeah, well, it would be lovely, but it takes such a long time. And we're going to look a little bit at how we can use it as a time-saving exercise. And of course, the last thing is that we're going to look at how do we have dialogues with those kind of people who don't really seem to be the kind of people that you can have dialogues with, right? We all come across people in our workplace that we find particularly challenging. Maybe we think that they won't listen to reason, and we have lots of reason, but somehow it's just, how do you do that? How can you have a productive dialogue with people who don't seem to want to have that productive dialogue? So this is the program for tonight, and hopefully we will also have a little bit of chat to just take questions, and so we can make it extra relevant for the people who are here. So yes, but over to you, Sarah, for the first, how do we make any dialogue more productive?
Okay, thank you, Claus. And so this is our first tool, and if you like, it's one of the more simple ways of understanding how to read the room. And by read the room, what I mean is, how do you, when you're maybe working in a team or with a small group, get a quick fix on what's happening if a conversation starts to get stuck or starts to derail, and how do you intervene more skillfully, whether you are just a participant in that conversation or perhaps leading the conversation. And this comes out of the work of David Cantor, who wrote a book called Reading the Room. And he, having observed many conversations, he began his career as a family therapist in the States, and with the permission of several families, put recording devices in the rooms in the different houses. And having observed their conversations and transcribed them and analysed them, came to the understanding that there are actually just 4 actions really that take place in a conversation. And if we cut to the chase here, what he found was that in healthy family systems, and I think by extension we can say teams and organizations, all 4 actions are present. And in the less healthy systems, 1 or more go missing. And what really helps is to bring in the missing action. And so we've got these 4 actions on a slide. So we've got a visual for you. Claus, if you could please bring that up. And I'm just going to talk you briefly through the 4 actions, and then let's see if we can bring this to life with a story or 2 about the missing actions. So here they are. Very simply, there is making a move in a conversation where you give it some direction. You might say things like, we really need to talk about next year's budget, or recruiting that team member we really need. That would be making a move, and it brings some clarity and some direction, and every conversation needs that. Then there are follows, and in this particular tool, a follow is when you support what somebody else says, when you agree with them, when you show some enthusiasm, you inject often some positivity in the conversation. So we've got our move, we've got the follow, and it really helps when that enthusiasm, when that support is verbalized. The third action is the oppose. It kind of speaks for itself. It's when people disagree, they push back, they challenge. And when that's done with respect, when it's done with the right tone, it's really helpful to have the oppose in the room, because it can provide some correction, perhaps to the move, to the thinking, to what's unfolding if we're not going in the optimal direction. Much better to have those opposes in the meeting room where you can explore them, unpack them, rather than have the opposes going on in the corridors, in the bilaterals around the meeting, because that's one of the things that makes decisions unravel after the event. And then finally, there's the bystand. And the bystand in this particular model is actually something quite active. These are all actions. And a bystand is when you take a step back and you bring in a wider perspective. So, for example, I was working with a team not so long ago, and they were a very high performing team, and yet they were absolutely investing in their dialogue skills. And one of the comments that one of the team members made was, do you know, there's very little politicking that takes place in this team. And there were lots of nods in agreement. And I think that's one of the reasons they were such a high performing team. And then somebody else observed, an additional bystand, yes, but there's lots of politicking that goes on amongst our direct reports and in the next layer around us. And that was all creating a lot of noise in the system. And that team then went on to explore what they might do about that politicking that was surrounding them. So that's an example of a bystand. It brings in that bigger picture. So we've got the 4 actions, and as I said, in a healthy conversation, we'd have a fluid movement amongst the 4 actions, but often actions go missing for good reasons. And maybe I can hand back to you at this point, Klaus. Maybe you could share a story or some observations about these 4 actions from your experience.
Yes, it's really important to have, like as Sarah was saying, it's very important to have all of the different types of comments present in any conversation. And if anyone is missing, then it can be a problem. I have a funny story, which is at one point I was working with a manager from the senior management team in an organization, and they had this. He told me how they had this discussion of purchasing a new building, a new office building, and as part of that, they were wondering what to do with parking, and there were different options. So some of the buildings they were looking at, they had parking spaces connected to the building, and others they didn't, and so they were like, maybe we can give vouchers to people who come and need to use other parking spaces and stuff like that. And as it often happens, there were this was apparently a very divisive topic, so everybody had a lot of opinions about it, and they discussed it ferociously. And after a while, somebody made a very interesting bystand and said, look, the difference between whether we do the one and the other is, it's monetarily speaking, it's not a lot. And by now we've spent half an hour of the top management's time discussing this. I think that's actually more expensive. I thought that was a wonderful bystand that sort of adjusted or brought in that perspective that was needed. And then they just made a decision and moved on. So yeah. Did you want to say more about the 4 speech acts.
Well, I'd love to open it up if there are any comments or questions from any of you. If you can think of a story or a moment where it's like, one of those was missing, or indeed any thoughts about how you might bring in a missing action. So it would be great to, whether you use the chat or unmute yourself. Annabelle, I just see your camera's gone on. Would you like to come in and share something here, Annabelle?
Well, I think that was just synchronous. I didn't intend to turn my camera on to say something. And I don't really have a particular example that I can think of at the moment of where all those four voices are important, but I do recognise that they are needed, and it's something which we're working on in the context that I'm working in at the moment, and encouraging people to notice if that any of one of those four voices. So, because the first two tend to be the most popular in terms of value systems. So I'm kind of quite curious about value systems and where the value is placed. And then encouraging, is there, if do we place as much value on the opposing role, or how does that feel if people are opposing a view, or how do we feel about the bystander? And I'm kind of curious about the bystander role and how you've explained that. I think that sort of, from performance point of view, so I'd be really interested as well if you've got any thoughts, or anyone's got any thoughts and reflections about performance and how performance is viewed, because I think there tends to be, or my observation is perhaps that there is less value placed on that more observing or bystanding role from a performance point of view. And that's having done sort of work with teams over a number of years, and where the prevailing view tends to be, hesitate to make sweeping statements here, but tends to be, I think, around action and activity, and reflection maybe doesn't have as much value. So just would like to test that in some way, if that's possible.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Annabelle. I think it's really interesting that the different actions, I think, do carry different values. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the narrative in the leadership world around moving away from command and control leadership into something that's more consultative or more collective. And I think in that old school model of leadership, the leader was seen as the one who made the moves, maybe made some opposes as well. Picking up on Louise's comment in the chat, was more on the dimension of advocacy and asserting themselves. And I think in a more expansive model of leadership, and a leadership that's more appropriate for team working and for these challenging times, a leader is able to flex their style and make not just the high value actions, which might be the move and the oppose, or perhaps the move and the follow, but can bring in, for example, a bystander as well, and enable other people to do that. So to create an environment where opposes are welcome. And again, I'm sure you're probably all familiar with the importance of psychological safety. And one way we could look at that in relation to this tool is, how do you get enough safety in the room that people, for example, can make an oppose, including perhaps to the idea of a more senior leader. So thank you, Annabelle. Any other questions or comments here? Okay.
Sarah, you kind of took the words out of my mouth just at the end about psychological safety. So that's something we're trying to instill in our organisation, Department of Health, so civil servant, and probably a user of the FSAC that you were talking about earlier on at the fast stream at the start. So psychological safety is really important, I think, and trying to build that is to get all four of those elements in there. And just another kind of counterbalance to that, so we run the annual people survey in the civil service every October or so, so we've had some results back for that, and in our particular team everything looks amazingly brilliant, that we're all very positive. But if there's something around, do we do enough with the bystand kind of element of meetings, because so there is an element of, are we all just being very nice and agreeing with each other, as opposed to a bit having that challenge come into the room, say, actually, I'm not sure this is the right thing for us to do here. Could we think about it in another way? So there is something about teams that might get on very well and seem to be very happy and friendly is not the same as a high performing team where disparate voices can be brought into the room and be done safely as well with the psychological safety.
Yeah, well, good on you for getting that great set of results, and your kind of curiosity about this. You know, could there be a risk in us being too nice, too polite? And certainly in some of the work I do in different organizations, sometimes it's about firefighting or managing conflict, and other times it's organizations or teams saying, we're interminably nice to one another, is what one client said. And actually that can stop us from having those more real conversations about what matters. So good that you've got your antennae out there. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you. So back to you, Klaus. Should we do more on this or move on to our second secret?
Let's move on to the second.
Okay.
So the second secret is how to use dialogue for saving time. And in a way, it's not so much as a secret as it's more of a perspective, because dialogue does save time. Even if the initial feeling is, well, you know, dialogue takes time. Sure, it takes time to meet and talk together. But when you see the bigger picture, you'll notice that you really save time in that way. So we have just one slide here illustrating this. So if you can say, well, yes, on the side of dialogue, sure, you need to take time building rapport, as we talked about before, building that the container and the psychological safety. That takes time. You need to design your session to be sure to establish great outcomes, to prepare materials, all of that. Yes, it's going to take a little bit of time. But if you discount that towards what the time it takes, if you do not engage in dialogue and therefore risk misalignment, on that side, think about how much time it takes to manage resistance, to navigate conflict, dealing with misunderstandings, and just the wasted work. Sometimes you will think that you agree on what needs to be done, and then people go off and they put in a lot of effort in doing what they think you agreed on. And then when you meet a week later or maybe a month later, they have done something and it wasn't at all what you wanted. And so all of this time wasted, right? Then back to square one. And of course that can generate a lot of frustration. It can make the business move at a slower pace. So development just happens slower due to misalignment, and it can generate dissatisfaction among stakeholders. And then in turn, you'll have to manage that these disaffected stakeholders. So this is just to give you a perspective on how, sure, having the conversation takes time, but not having the conversation often takes a lot more time when you look at the big picture. And so I have an interesting story. I remember once I was working with a big international transportation company. And so they move packages around, and if packages come from outside Europe, they have to create some custom declarations, and they have to have those custom declarations approved before they can deliver the packages to the customers. And of course, everybody expects like same-day delivery or faster. And so you really have to make those custom declarations very quickly, and there's not a lot of time. And so they have these computer systems to help them. And I remember in this company, there was in the Danish department, they had some trouble with a certain type of parcel, where a certain kind of mistake always happened, and they had to spend a lot of time doing all of this by hand or manually. And they've been trying to explain the issue to the Central Industrial Engineering Department. And so they would keep sending tickets to industrial engineering and say, please fix this. And industrial engineering would do something and move things around a bit and say, now it should be working. And it wasn't. And so it had gone on for a couple of years by then. And think about how much time that had taken, both in terms of a slower work process, in terms of tickets being sent back and forth, in terms of sometimes they would, mistakes would happen and parcels would get on the truck and had to be retracted and all these kind of things because the custom declaration hadn't been approved yet. Enormous amount of time over years. At one point, the head of industrial engineering comes to Denmark, has 2 days there, and has a lot of meetings. You can imagine, right? This is the top industrial engineering person who has, well, all the countries in Europe, and all the countries have like semi-disasters and firefighting, and so very busy. And I insisted that in his busy schedule, the 2 days, he would have to have 20 minutes where he would sit down in front of a computer screen and the people in the customs department would show him what is the issue on the screen and have that conversation to be sure that they were on the same page and understood each other. And the day before, of course, he contacted me and said, Claus, I have so many things, they're so important. Can we skip this meeting? And I said, absolutely not. After the meeting, he came over to me and he was like, okay, I get it now. It wasn't at all what we thought it was. Now I get it. And then they fixed it. And that was literally a 20-minute investment. Had they done that years earlier, they would have saved so much time. So this is just to put it into bigger perspective, even though we have that feeling, that dialogue, we don't have time for it, and we're all very busy. When you look at the bigger picture, it's very good to see how much time you can actually save. So yeah, so that was secret number 2. And how many people can you relate to this? Does it make sense? How many people, just put up your hand or give me a thumbs up in the chat if you've ever experienced misalignment taking a lot of time. Yeah, exactly. So yes, good. I see thumbs up.
Yeah. Maybe, Claus, I could just share on the back of your story a couple of things. So one is that, and I really learned this from Bill Isaacs, is that sometimes when there's a lot of resistance to change in the room, it can be really powerful to have a dialogue framed around 2 questions. And the questions are along these lines: what's at risk if we make this change? And then you invite people to voice their concerns and you get the objections out and the critical comments and so on. And then the second question is, and what's at risk if we don't make this change? And that often really is an invitation to do some thinking together. And I have seen on a number of occasions that when a team or a group or a set of stakeholders sets aside half a day or even just a couple of hours to really talk through those questions and think things through, in the longer term, they actually save a lot of time, because they're not then having to manage lots of resistance and all those corridor conversations that I spoke about earlier. So just one way to kind of lean in to having what might be a testy dialogue that could save you time. What's at risk if we make the change? What's at risk if we don't?
Yeah, very good questions. Very nice way of framing dialogue, a productive dialogue. And that leads us on to the third of the secrets. How do you have conversations with people you don't like, you think are resisting reason, yeah, how do you use these tools in that situation? And this is very much relating to the oppose part that we were seeing before. And we have another little slide that I want to show you. So before we looked at these 4 speech acts, the move, follow, oppose, and bystand. And of course, for each of these speech acts, you can say you can practice getting good at those speech acts. And the practices for each of these speech acts are called voicing, listening, respecting, and suspending. So to get really good at making moves, you would have to practice voicing. To get really good at following, you would have to practice listening, makes intuitive sense, I assume. And to be really good at opposing, you have to practice respecting. And to be really good at bystanding, you have to practice suspending your fixed beliefs and so on. So this makes intuitive sense, I think. And of course, on a 1 hour webinar, we won't have time to sort of go in depth with all of them. So that's why we've chosen to focus a little bit on the practice of respecting, because that is one that can be a little bit puzzling, but also extremely giving, very, very fruitful. So when you oppose somebody, it's very good to do it with respect, because it opens that other person's ears, and because it keeps yourself in a frame of mind where you are unlikely to go into this kind of entrenchment type warfare that we sometimes see in dialogues, right? Or when you see dialogues on TV, it's often these kind of, we put 2 people in a room who completely don't understand each other's perspective, and then they're just trying to win the argument. And this is not very productive. So by bringing in or practicing respecting, we can upgrade our capacity for opposing in a way that leads to productive dialogue. And briefly said, respecting has 2 components. The one component is to have as the basis for your engagement in the dialogue, the belief that if somebody in the dialogue expresses an opinion, it is possible to hold this opinion with integrity. So many times I've seen when working with dialogue, and you ask people, why do you think that person you disagree with have the opinion they have? Many times people will say it's because they're disingenuous or devious or stupid or something like this. And assuming that that is the reason people hold an opinion generally doesn't lead to very fruitful dialogue. And also, most of the time, it's just plain and simple wrong. So holding the belief that the reason somebody says something that seems very strange to you or even incomprehensible is because they have a certain life experience, a certain viewpoint, a certain knowledge that leads them to highlight certain things and have a specific standpoint on the issue that is surprising to you. And this is also where you can get really curious and you can get really, if somebody expresses an opinion where you say, well, how can anybody have that opinion? That should trigger your curiosity. And you go like, I can learn something by engaging with this person. If I engage with people where I understand their standpoint, it can be very nice and pleasant, but it's probably not going to stretch my mind as much as when I engage with somebody who has something that at first glance looks like a very outlandish standpoint to me. So that's the one thing. The other part of respecting that's very important is to know that no matter how much you understand another person's point of view, you can never understand it fully because you're not that person. So we might be very empathetic, we might be very good at seeing things from somebody else's perspective, at putting ourselves in somebody else's shoes, but we can never understand them fully. The reason this is so important is because sometimes, again, when I work with managers, you will hear them say something like this about colleagues or employees. They say, yes, I understand their perspective, but what they don't see is that, right? And so they take this stance where they say, I understand their perspective fully, but they don't understand my perspective. So what is needed in this conversation is that I educate them on my standpoint. And again, this is not particularly fruitful because you don't get what is it that you are not hearing from the other? What is it that you can learn from talking to the other? Your ears are kind of closed when you have that standpoint. So these are the two components of respecting. Understanding that if you meet a standpoint in somebody else that seems outlandish to you, it's possible to have had certain life experiences that make that standpoint seem obvious. Second, it's important that you know you can never fully comprehend the standpoint because you're not that person. And so to illustrate this, I recently, maybe half a year ago or something like this, I was out doing a workshop on dialogue skills. And this was for a group of people who their work is that they go into elementary schools and have conversations with teachers, parents, and students about alcohol consumption. And so they say this is really important because research shows that if you can delay the time where young people start drinking alcohol, it just solves a whole host of societal problems. So that's their agenda. And of course, if you're a parent and your child is in a class where half of the people there, or half of the people in the class are not allowed to drink, and the other half, they bring a bottle of hard liquor to every party, to take an extreme example, it can be pretty difficult to enforce those rules for your kid. And this is why it's very nice to have those conversations where the parents and the students agrees on certain ground rules around alcohol. So that's the setting. And then they said, every now and then they meet that parent or a couple of parents who have a viewpoint that seems absolutely ludicrous to them. So they will say something along the lines of, I started drinking when I was 6 and it's never done me any harm. So, why should I prevent my kid from doing it? And then they would say, and also look at Jenny, her parents are the strictest parents, and she's the one that always gets most drunk at parties. So it doesn't even work to put down boundaries for your kids, right? It's futile. And then when the facilitators of the dialogue are a little bit desperate and say, well, the research says, this character will say, I don't believe in the research. And then they are at their wits' end and say, how do you have a dialogue with this person? And so we talked a little bit about that. And one thing that I think is really good when you want to oppose somebody with respect is, okay, what they're saying is just plain and simple wrong, right? The research is done, it's solid, it's been replicated. What they're saying is just plain and simple wrong. So how do you engage in and they won't admit that they did wrong. They cannot be convinced. You've probably all had conversations with people like this, right? They cannot be convinced. So instead of spending your energy on trying to convince this person, because that's just going to close their ears even more, you can say, okay, can I give an even stronger expression to their point of view? And can I maybe hear in their point of view something that they are not expressing, but which actually is a really good and valid point? Because if I can do that, and if I can put words to that, now we can have a dialogue. So we reflected a little bit on where does this standpoint come from, and what is it that they're actually saying behind the words, which they might not say very clearly or at all themselves. And we focused on that story with a kid where they said, well, this child has the strictest parents and they drink the most. Because if you listen to that story, you get, they are concerned about preserving a good relationship to their child. They say, if I put down strict boundaries, I might risk that my child just cuts me off and won't listen to me at all, and I'll lose any kind of influence over the child, or any kind of, like, they won't come to me when they have trouble. This is a really good and valid point. And when we include that in the conversation, now the conversation is not just about the question, what kind of boundaries should we put to the children, but the conversation becomes about what kind of boundaries should we put, and how should we put it in a way so we preserve a good relationship. Incidentally, I think this story is really interesting because it also relates a lot to leadership. Think about how many times you have to put down boundaries to colleagues or employees, and you might be worried that it's going to damage the working relationship. Once I was working with a manager of a big international oil company, and she was sitting in the central unit that analyzed data from different drilling sites. And she said they had like offshore teams, and they had portfolios of drilling sites. And usually, she said, the teams are very optimistic. They think that 9 out of 10 of their drilling sites are going to give amazing return on investment. But when we crunch the numbers, the reality is 1 out of 10 is going to give return on investments. And so we have to go back to them and kind of shatter their dreams, right? And say, well, you think you have a fantastic portfolio, you really don't. And sometimes they run into problems where the people don't trust in the analysis. Again, I don't believe in the research. And they can go off and start buying up lands and initiating negotiation with local governments on a drilling site that the central unit knows will never give return on investment. And again, how do you have a conversation with them in such a way that you shut down that project because you have to, but you still have a good working relationship with them? And here, the key factor is really respect, opposing with respect. So that is the third secret, you can say, the practice of respecting. And of course, there's a lot more to say about respecting. There's a lot more to say about all the different practices relating to the different, how to get good at the different speech acts. But yes, but that takes longer to get into that. So I don't know, Sarah, do you have something you want to add around this third secret of how to oppose with respect?
Maybe I'll just say a few words about where the 4 practices come from, and then we'd love to open it up and invite any further comments, questions about these practices or anything that we've covered with the secrets. So I mentioned earlier Bill Isaacs, who has written the book Dialogue and the Art of Thinking Together. And Bill Isaacs worked closely with a practitioner called Peter Garrett here in the UK. I worked with Peter for a number of years. And Peter Garrett is the founder, a co-founder of a charity, of a not-for-profit called Prison Dialogue. And for many years, Peter has gone into prisons, facilitating dialogues between prison staff and inmates. And it was in conversations with Bill Isaacs that Peter and Bill came up and articulated the 4 practices from their observations about what it took to make dialogue work in a really difficult setting, really difficult to build bridges. I didn't do much of the prison dialogue work. I did do a bit. They were in maximum security prisons with male inmates, very tricky going in as a woman. But I really learned to go in and cultivate a mindset that was something like this. Nobody does anything wrong given their model of the world. And I found if I came from that place, then I could sit in the circle with people who, yeah, they were in prison, there had been criminal behavior. But if I actually tried to understand their model of the world and really respect that and respect them as a human being without agreeing with the behavior that had landed them in prison, then that helped the dialogue to keep going. So we don't have to agree with people, but we acknowledge, as Klaus was saying, that the point of view they're holding has an integrity to it for them. And it can be hard work to do that, but it absolutely helps to build bridges. So just to add that bit about where these practices have come from.
And I think that's a really good point. This also we talked about before, how some organizations, people are too nice to each other. And this is really the golden middle road between being too nice and being dismissive. So yeah,
and I think in a way what we're pointing to here, I think most teams that I've worked with or observe know how to do debate. They know how to do serial monologues, but actually getting into the territory of a real dialogue, a real discussion about what matters, requires an expanded skill set. Deeper listening, the respecting that Klaus was talking about, the style flex. How can I bring in, for an example, a bystand, not just another move or another pose? And I think that is an expanded skill set, and that's kind of what we're touching on here.
Yeah. Good. So I think it's time to round off, and before we round off, I'll just say that it's been very nice to have you here tonight. We do these webinars every now and then, and we'll let you know when the next one is. And if you liked it, then you can sort of spread the news to other people who might be interested. And of course, we run workshops, and both open workshops. We have one in April, I think, coming up, and also in-house workshops. So if you are interested in getting mine and Sarah's help with learning this expanded skill sets, then you are very welcome to send either of us a mail. You'll receive a follow-up mail after this webinar with our mail addresses. And we're very happy to just have an informal chat with you about how we might assist you in learning, you and your team maybe, in learning this expanded skill set. So really feel free to just get in touch, and we'll be very happy to chat with you. Good.
Thank you for coming today. Really appreciate you investing an hour of your time.